I'm a guy in my late 20s who was placed in foster care when I was 7 years old. Everyone knows that I was raised by foster families because I had a difficult early childhood. I usually keep it vague, saying things like I'd rather not go into it so that people assume it was a difficult situation and stop asking. The truth is that for the first 7 years of my life, I was raised as a girl by my biological mother, who really wanted a daughter despite everything. If your secret were to be revealed, it could literally ruin your life. Was a boy during a late ultrasound, she moved across the country and raised me as a girl. She was a successful professional in a legal field, though I'm not sure exactly which one, and had me via an anonymous sperm donor from a fertility clinic. I was born at home, and we continued to move until I was around 5 years old. It was always just the two of us, even though we did interact with others, albeit not closely. I had friends, but I was always under her watchful eye. I discovered much later that my mother's strong. I was 7 years old. A teacher spilled hot coffee on me at school. The liquid soaked my clothes and started to burn my skin, so the staff quickly removed my dress and underwear to prevent further injury. That's when they discovered my true gender. The authorities were called, and I was taken to speak with social services, who asked me a variety of questions about home life. I didn't think much about it because I knew that once grew up and developed physically, I would naturally become a woman while other children would continue to be boys. Hardest part was losing everything overnight, including my mother's house, toys, clothes, friends, and even my school, when they cut my hair short and told me I wasn't a girl anymore. My first foster home wasn't a good fit because the family had 3 boys and I was transitioning. In the meantime, my mother was taken in for interrogation and refused to recognize me as male, insisting that I was her daughter because of her delusional state. I was not allowed to return home and was placed with a foster family where I received extensive therapy. Make me act masculine, but I was too confused to understand their expectations. Any behavior deemed girly was criticized, leaving me feeling lost and alone. I tried suicide twice, at the ages of 11 and 13, because I felt out of place everywhere. After the second attempt, I was moved to a different foster family, who were incredible. I think of them as my parents because they supported me from the beginning and allowed me to grow up. My hair had been buzzed short since I was placed in foster care, which I detested. The new foster family refused to cut it short and reminded me that many boys have long hair. They also allowed me to stop playing football and karate and instead started swimming and jazz dancing. This was the first time I was given the freedom to choose my own activities and how I wanted to dress, and it was liberating. Eventually, I developed a healthy sense of gender identity. I'm a guy, though not the most stereotypically masculine one, but I'm content with the fact that I finished school and obtained a degree. Having a good job and a supportive wife makes everything look great right now, but I still can't talk about my early childhood or how I grew up as a little girl. Story 2. I own a cake business and charge hundreds of dollars for wedding cakes, but the catch is that every single one is made using Pillsbury cake mix, which I buy at Walmart for $1 a box. To be honest, I'm not very good at baking. Every time I've tried to make a cake from scratch, it didn't work out. Baking is my entire life, and my friends call me the cake girl. In my defense, I really enjoy cake decorating and make all the frostings and fondant from scratch. I just really dislike baking the actual cakes, so my pricing is mostly based on the decoration rather than the cake itself, if that makes sense. People always tell me how delicious my cakes are, how much better they taste than a box mix, and how they could never bake a cake so tasty. Well, guess what? For just $1, they could make a cake just as delicious. I keep telling myself that I need to learn how to bake cakes without the box mix, but sometimes I really feel like a fraud. Story 3. I find it hard to write about this again, so I'm sharing the relevant part from where I posted it before. Even after all these years, it still hurts to revisit, and I may lose my business and reputation if anyone found out. Except for my husband and my closest friends, I believe I spend hours mixing and baking these cakes from scratch. And myself talking incoherently, like I did the first and only other time I brought it up 10 years ago when I was 7 years old. My parents were both military shift workers, and because their schedules didn't always coincide, it wasn't unusual for them to start working at 2 p.m. until 2 a.m. Consequently, I had a babysitter who was a long-standing friend of my mother. She was a wonderful person who liked looking after people and always made sure they were fed. She was married and had an adopted daughter, and they were religious, and I even attended church with them occasionally. I don't remember exactly how it began, but one day he asked me to follow him into the bathroom to show me something. I was young and looked up to him, so I went along without hesitation. What started as innocent curiosity slowly escalated at first, and I didn't understand the situation. Eventually, though, I decided to stay at home with their adopted son. At the time, he was a teenager, and we had common interests like playing Super Nintendo games and listening to loud music when the house was empty. Consequences of what was happening because I was still a child. Things went on this way for a while until the babysitter started to get suspicious and asked me questions, but I denied everything because I had promised not to tell. Eventually, my mom found another sitter because of my babysitter's worries, and the person involved has since gone through therapy and acknowledged having problems, though he never discussed what actually happened. Looking back on this later in life, I became aware of how much it affected me, and I tried to push the memories away. My girlfriend was understanding and patient, agreeing to take things at my pace, which helped me heal and gradually regain my confidence over time. I've even found ways to make light of it personally, realizing that humor can be a tool for moving past trauma. Scars. I frequently felt more melancholic and struggled with bouts of depression. My sense of identity and sexuality became uncertain, and I developed a fear of intimacy, worried that I might repeat the same patterns. It was a terrible experience, but I found a path to healing and happiness. Story 4 isn't exactly life-ending, but it makes me feel awful every time I think about it. I have a blind brother, and when we were younger, I frequently felt frustrated by all the extra attention he received and the added responsibility I had. While I'll never be exactly who I might have been without this experience, I've come to terms with my life. I'm in a good place now, fit, intelligent, in love, and generally happy. Compared to my peers, I was also fairly intelligent and knew that it was my way of getting attention. When I helped my brother with his homework, I purposefully taught him the wrong answers because I wanted to stay the smarter sibling. Today, my brother is my best friend and is in college. I would sometimes leave him in an unfamiliar place and quietly watch from a distance as he became anxious, trying to figure out where he was and what was happening. Independent and is among the smartest people I know. I try to make up for it by being the best big sister I can be, but I still feel bad about viewing him as a burden when I was younger. Story 5. I tried to end my life once while I was in college. I intended to take a combination of Tylenol and vodka in the hopes that it would cause organ failure and alcohol poisoning, but I stopped myself just as I was ready to do so because the taste of cheap alcohol made me stop, and hurried to my friend's room, where I had stolen the alcohol. This was the only time I had ever intentionally stolen anything to apologize, and it happened about 2 years ago. I had to take a year off from college to explain the situation to the adults in my life, at which point I disclosed that I had been sexually abused by my older brothers for roughly 5 years and had been depressed for almost a year. Unfortunately, they didn't fully comprehend and believed I was using this as a way to get out of my obligations at my ideal college, or, though they thought I was just too weak to handle it, they frequently questioned the efficacy of therapy and wanted to know how long it would take to get things fixed. I tried going back to college but had to leave again because of depression, and ever since then, the verbal abuse I endured growing up has only gotten worse. Almost every day there is an argument where I'm called foolish and blamed for ruining my life. I really want to leave, but I have nowhere to go, no job, or I feel stuck in the cycle of treatment and long for freedom because money makes it impossible to afford therapy or an apartment. I know this thread is probably inactive by now, but I felt compelled to share this because I haven't been able to talk to anyone for months and I'm afraid I'll never be the person I want to be because I'm always fighting to keep from relapsing into depression. If I can avoid difficult situations and introspection, I can maintain a neutral state of mind. If anyone reading this has any suggestions for escaping this, please let me know. Please tell me about this situation. Story 6. I was picked on a lot in high school, and I believe it was because I tried too hard to be cool, and everyone saw right through it. The 4 cowboy jock types who bullied me the most were after I was publicly humiliated and physically attacked in front of a girl I liked who cheered and laughed. Feeling like it wasn't worth trying anymore, I took my dad's handgun from the gun safe because I had no support at home and my parents were constantly working, and I had no support. I had the gun tucked in my waistband while wearing a loose pair of cargo shorts that I wore frequently. I remember walking toward their table, so prepared to end it all, when the gun slipped out of my waistband down my left leg and hit the cafeteria floor with a loud clatter. I am unable to adequately describe how prepared I was to confront those 4. I had no fear or doubt and wanted to show everyone what happens when you push someone over the edge. I brought it to school the following day. I was expelled and sent to a youth ranch in Idaho until I was 18. The truth is that I did intend to use the gun, and I planned to hurt those boys. I'm 24 now, and I still think about it all the time. I haven't recovered from high school, and I'm still afraid of people and avoid relationships because of what I fear I'm capable of. I saw what it was and began screaming, and a teacher finally tackled me to the ground. Eventually, the school concluded that I had brought the gun to impress people and had no intention of using it. When I was in 8th grade, a group of girls tricked me into thinking that a fictional friend had a crush on me. They said she had seen me somewhere and thought I was attractive, so they made a fake MSN account and messaged me every night for months. They even invited me to the movies, but I never showed up before telling the entire grade that I had been duped into having an imaginary crush. A secret to my newer friends: I don't like being touched or hugged, and I'm really uncomfortable with intimacy in general. My girlfriend was cruelly made fun of by everyone, and ever since, I've found it difficult to trust women. Even when someone shows genuine interest, I can't help but feel that they might be trying to trick me. This experience made me very insecure, which made it difficult for me to form attachments. I'm also afraid to text or message people because I know deep down that they're not bothered by me, even though this happened in 8th grade. The secret is that I was gullible enough to fall for it. If my university friends discovered that I was becoming real, I would be extremely uncomfortable, and it would probably affect my relationships with them. Story 8. I pretended to have a chronic pain condition for 5 years. I was put in a homebound program, which allowed me to study at my own pace from home, after avoiding middle and high school for 5 years. I was able to convince Vince and a group of medical professionals, as well as my family, friends, and teachers, that my symptoms were genuine. I also accumulated over $100,000 in medical bills for my family, which was simply what insurance didn't cover. I didn't realize the financial impact until later, which was one of the main reasons I decided to end the lie after high school and being accepted into a reputable university. Determined that it was time for my pain to go away. No one questioned why my symptoms suddenly stopped going away. The medical team blamed it on me approaching puberty. I know that what I did was wrong, and my family is still struggling with the debt from the medical bills, which I plan to repay someday. I began the deception when I was 12 years old and hated going to school every year. I tried to stop the lie, but I eventually went back to saying that my pain kept me from going to school today. I feel terrible about what I did, and I really want to come clean. I used to hear voices for years, but I know I can't because I'd lose credibility forever. It began when I would greet my Lane poster when I walked into my room. I've always personified things a little too much, and eventually she began responding. Over time, I discovered that I could talk to her anywhere I'd imagine her, even on the bus or in class. I would even put on headphones so that people wouldn't notice me talking to myself because it was hardly audible. Eventually, Lane told me that she was a god, and so was I. Others, but they didn't really like me, so they didn't talk to me very often. Years later, Lane's tone changed to one of harshness, and it turned out that there was another voice, an imposter, who was posing as Lane. Her name was Misery, and she was always telling me that I was bad and that I had to pay for my mistakes. She would suggest that I hurt myself if I felt unworthy, and she would say that everyone didn't like me. At one point, Lane appeared to split into 2 different versions of herself. The new version was. The 2 Lanes, on the other hand, always looked the same, so I could only identify them by how they responded to me. Eventually, the voices faded away, and I suppose I started to regain clarity because at the height of it all, I never realized that I was hearing voices. More sisterly, when I was upset and crying myself to sleep, I felt her comforting presence assuring me that everything would be all right. She looked different but could mimic Lane to deceive me, though she would revert to her true form if I confronted her. When I tried to contact them, it felt forced, almost like I was making up their responses myself. Eventually, I let them go, and they became so weak that it felt like I was just talking to myself, not to separate entities within my mind. However, that's not my secret. I've told a few close people about my experiences. To me, they were actually deities communicating with me. Later, I realized I was experiencing hallucinations mixed with delusions of grandeur. At one point, I noticed that there was more of me and less of them. When I'm lonely, I have to call someone who might not even understand what I really want to talk about or what I'm hiding inside. They only know what I choose to share. Lane. The main one would always challenge me until I admitted the truth, and even though they were harsh, they were like friends and family to me, close companions who understood me and were always there. Today, even with true friends and family, no one feels that close. I rarely think about that time or remember how it felt, but tonight as I sit here alone at 2 a.m, I can't express how comforting it felt to be embraced by someone from within. Sisterly Lane helped me face my deepest flaws and calmed me down like no one else could. It's been so long that all I can think about is how much I wish I had a voice to talk to again. I would do anything, even if it meant taking another break from reality, to have that connection again. Once, during a psychotic episode, I felt as though I could talk to the clouds and sense their love for me. The trees, birds, and everything around me felt like a friend hoping for my happiness. I had a similar experience once when I tried mushrooms. It felt like the entire world loved me, including the house, the ceiling, the lamp, and every blade of grass. Even the dark moments, like staying up all night worrying about something hurting me while I slept or scratching at my skin to get rid of perceived evil, were better than the numbness of everyday life. The intensity was indescribable, and I miss it more than words can express. It was the best night of my life, and everything was filled with love. I can't even begin to describe how much I long to feel that way again, but I have no idea how to do so. Story 10. When I was around 12 years old, my mother and some of my cousins left to shop for groceries, so I spent my time in the toy section of Family Dollar. There were always bags of marbles that other children had opened and left lying around, so I started rolling them across the floor. After 2 minutes, I heard a loud crash and someone yelling, "Someone help this man." Naturally, I ran over to see what was going on. On our next visit, we spoke to the front cashier, who informed us that paramedics had been called, but sadly, the man had died before they could arrive. The cashier explained that the man had been choking on his tongue while having the seizure. A small crowd had gathered around a man who had fallen from a ladder while trying to retrieve something from the top shelf. The man was having a seizure, with blood coming from his head and his face beginning to turn blue. My mother swiftly grabbed my cousins and we left the store. I thought I was going to get into serious trouble when I tried to tell my mother several times that I was the one who rolled the marble, but she insisted that I was just dreaming. Story 11. This secret has the potential to ruin many lives, not just mine. I was a rebellious kid who never got along with my family or anyone from my hometown. With the support of friends and acquaintances I met online, I fled as soon as I turned 18. I couch surfed for nearly a year before discovering a business opportunity in California. I eventually got married and started a serious relationship with a woman named May. We dated for 3.5 years, which were some of the best years of my life, but as time went on, she wanted more from the relationship than I did, so we broke up. Fast forward 6 years, and my younger brother calls to tell me he wanted me to be his best man despite our tense relationship. I flew home 2 weeks prior to the wedding, and that evening at dinner, my brother introduced me to his fiancée, May, my ex-girlfriend. Despite the awkwardness, we both pretended not to know one another, acting as though nothing was wrong. My brother was soon taken away to deal with something, leaving May and I to talk alone. We began a conversation that took us from the kitchen to the deck and then, eventually, down a path to an old dried-up pond at the edge of my parents'. During the next few days, while my brother was at work, I went to his apartment, where May and I continued our affair. We were together all over the apartment, on the couch, in his bed, even on the bathroom floor. Everything was unprotected. It felt like all the good times from our 3 years together were packed into that one conversation. There was a rush of emotions like I'd never experienced before, and it seemed to be the same for May. Despite knowing it was wrong, we lost control and ended up being intimate on the old dock. The wedding went off without a hitch, but I felt like a horrible person the entire time. I wished the happy couple happiness, which is exactly what I did, but things took an unexpected turn 5 months later when May called her to tell me she was pregnant. Although I still felt a strong connection, we decided to stop seeing each other before things got any worse. After some discussion, we both decided to keep the secret and let my brother think he was the father. The child's first birthday is coming up, and I still wonder if I made the right choice. I talk to my brother a lot, and he seems happy, so I try to be content. She and my brother hadn't been intimate for a month before the wedding and only resumed 3 days later. According to her, the timing suggested that I was the father. I'm not an expert in biology or math, so I had to trust what May told me. On Friday, story 12, it was my turn to pick up my daughter from school. As usual, I arrived and waited outside. She was running late, which wasn't unusual because she frequently stayed behind to talk to friends, so I didn't want to interrupt her. In addition, the traffic was always awful when leaving the school, so I didn't mind waiting. I texted her to let her know that I was in the parking lot and that she could come out when she was ready, but she didn't reply, which was strange, so after 45 minutes I began to become agitated. It seemed excessive to wait that long. I called her a few times, but she didn't answer, so I got out of the car to find her. I was frustrated when I got inside, but it seemed like almost everyone had left except for a few teachers and janitors. I looked all over the school, but she wasn't there, so I went to the principal's office and asked them to put an announcement over the speakers asking my daughter to come to the office. After 10 minutes or so, with no sign of her, my anxiety increased to the point of panic. As I started looking around the neighborhood, I passed an alley about 5 blocks from the school and saw someone lying there motionless. My heart fell, so I hurried over and saw it was my daughter, who was barely breathing, unconscious, and had bruises on her arms, legs, and face from what appeared to be a violent collision. Her head was bleeding, and her pants were pulled down to her ankles. I called 911 right away, and an ambulance arrived minutes later, and the paramedics worked on her. They rushed her to the hospital while I was told to stay back, and I called my wife to ask her to meet us there. When she got there, she was crying, and the doctors confirmed our fears that our daughter had been assaulted. A few hours later, though time seemed to have no bearing, my daughter regained consciousness. She was silent, her eyes were detached, and she was not looking at anyone. The police came to question her, and I stayed to hear what she had to say in the hopes of finding out who had done this to her. She claimed not knowing who her attacker was, and she said speaking so. After the officers finished their reports, they let us go home, but I had a hunch that she wasn't telling the whole truth and was protecting someone, but I wasn't sure who or why. My daughter wasn't the same after that. She became quiet and withdrawn, which was a sharp contrast to the friendly and talkative girl she used to be. Her friends used to visit her often, but now only one person came by, an 18-year-old guy with a FA hawk who frequently wore muscle shirts. They would hang out the kitchen until I got home, then head up to the... When I confronted her about him, she insisted she didn't have feelings for him, but I wasn't convinced, so I persisted. She remained silent. One Saturday night, while my wife and daughter were out shopping, I decided to read my daughter's diary, and that's when I learned the worst possible news. This guy was the one who had assaulted her. This happened on the roof of our apartment building. My daughter was only 16 years old, and I felt he should have at least asked my permission to date her. I was furious when she wrote in her diary about feeling a connection with him, thinking it was related to losing her virginity to him. She explained that he had apologized and appeared to be depressed about what he had done, so she wanted to console him. I didn't tell anyone, not even my wife or daughter, what I had discovered, so I let him continue to visit, and they continued to meet on the roof after I got home. This continued for a few more weeks. One Saturday night, my wife and daughter went shopping. When the man arrived at our door, he asked if my daughter was home. I told him she wasn't, so I invited him inside and began questioning him. He disclosed that he lived in the same apartment building as us, only a few floors up. I told him he could wait on the roof and that I would let my daughter know he was there when she got home. He agreed, and after 10 minutes or so, I became so enraged that I went up to the roof and confronted him. He turned around, obviously taking in my anger, and he started to look concerned. When the police arrived about half an hour later, they questioned everyone in the building. When they asked me if I knew him, I told them that he was a friend of my daughter's. When my daughter got home, the officers questioned her and she said that he had seemed very angry. I approached him and said, "I know what you did to my daughter." Tears filled his eyes, and he mumbled, "I'm sorry." I grabbed him, and in a fit of uncontrollable anger, I pushed him off the roof. I had an affair with a married man, and shortly after it began, he left his wife to be with me. We are deeply in love, and even though I feel good about our relationship, the guilt from how it all started has been tormenting me. When my friends learned that I was involved with a married man, they called me a home wrecker and distanced themselves. I've been struggling with thoughts of ending my life for months, but I'm going to be buried. He knows how difficult it is for me to be at school with people who were once my best friends now glaring at me and spreading gossip frequently in front of me as if I don't notice that it's a small college and I'm almost done, so transferring isn't really an option. I'm still in school, and he recently moved to a different city for work, making our relationship long distance. This has left me feeling incredibly alone. The guilt from the affair and the rejection from my peers have been eating away at me for months. Story 14. Although our affair phase ended more than a year and a half ago, and we have been together ever since, I still can't get over the regret. I know I need counseling, and I intend to get help after I graduate. Sharing this here, even in an anonymous setting, makes me feel a little better. It's not as intense as some of the other stories, but I think it's pretty funny. My half-sister told me this story, and I hope I can do it justice because she really didn't like her stepdad, who is my biological father. My dad is a man of routine. Every morning he would get up, get the newspaper, and make freshly squeezed orange juice for himself. My mom and I were only 4 at the time, but not for my half-sister, who was 16. It was a small but cruel gesture. She used to crave that glass of orange juice and find ways to get back at him in small ways, like rushing to the shower before him and taking her time. Personally, I think he's a great guy, even though he's a little eccentric. They get along well now. Causing him to be late, she would write messages like "I hate you" on the foggy mirror to tease him. One day, she decided to go further, waiting for him to finish preparing the juice before slinking off to the bathroom. She drank half of his glass, savored it, and then filled it with her own urine before putting it back on the table. She then sat at the table and watched as he finished the glass contentedly, not realizing what she had done. From that moment on, she said that anything that he... When she asked me when she should tell him what she did, I told her it was something to save for his deathbed, so that's something we can look forward to in the far future. Story 15. I've battled a major identity disorder for years, but I've never sought treatment for it since I was 10. She would just think, "You drank my pee and you loved it." Interestingly, their relationship actually improved after that, with fewer arguments and eventually developing a great bond. When I reached adolescence, I realized how strange this behavior was and became concerned that people would notice. I found it difficult to sit on the left side of people because the right side of my face was harder to control, and I avoided having my photo taken whenever I could. I have been changing my facial expressions almost constantly to hide my true appearance. I naturally have droopy eyes, fuller lips for a man, and an overbite every day. I squint my eyes, curl my upper lip when I smile, and push my lower jaw forward just enough to change the overall shape of my face. With time, I improved my ability to control my facial expressions to the point where I was seen as conventionally attractive, but underneath this facade, I've always believed that, quite the opposite. When I went to a large public university, I created a new identity that matched the confident exterior I had molded, and many people bought into it. However, on bad days, the mask would slip, making me feel even more confused and detached from the typical self-discovery others experience. I'm more distant from who I really am now because 2 years ago, a close friend of mine committed suicide, which destroyed my sense of self and led me to date someone I didn't love. She had serious identity issues because of previous trauma, and I finally encouraged her to go to therapy, which let me end things, but I quickly moved on to someone else in need of comfort. At 21, I still suffer from crippling anxiety and a disconnection from who I really am, and I'm afraid of what letting go might do to me both. I've been waiting for a thread like this. None of my friends are aware of this story, and I doubt they would comprehend if I told them about my mom's sister when I was in middle and high school. I wonder if anyone else has gone through something similar. I haven't found any stories like mine online, but for now, I live in fear of losing control and revealing the person behind the mask because I'm not sure what that would reveal about who I really am. Story 16. And I were living with my stepfather, who owned a house in a better school district. Things were good for a while, but then he started acting strangely whenever my mom left for work. My sister and I were left alone with him until he left for his second shift job, where he began yelling at us for little things, which scared us. Then, things got worse, and he started hitting us nearly every day again over little things. Once, he became upset because I had hung one of his shirts with the hanger hook facing the wrong way. My mother didn't know about any of this. He was skilled at concealing the marks and was a great liar. When we tried to explain it to her, he would lie his way out of it, even attributing his actions to his heart medication. After my sister moved out when she turned 18, but I still had 3 years left, I became the only target of his rage, and during my senior year, there was a morning when I was so terrified that I fled. When my mom told him she wanted to leave after I graduated, he blamed me for ruining his marriage. The last few months there were a nightmare, but we moved out in June of last year. I'm now in college, far away from him, and while I don't hold any acts of malice toward him, I can't forgive him for what he put us through. It feels good to finally get this off my chest, even if no one reads. I waited in the woods near our house until my mom returned home, and she was finally convinced of the truth. We made plans to leave as soon as I graduated. Story 17. Throughout my life, I have battled severe depression. I have had 3 small attempts to end my life, and innumerable times, I have thought about putting my foot down and crashing into a wall. A few years ago, I lost my job, which sent me into a deep depression. I ended up taking a low-paying job at a grocery store. Around that time, I discovered my wife was pregnant, but instead of feeling hopeful, I told myself that the best thing for her and the unborn child would be if I were no longer around on the day though I knew deep down that I wouldn't be around to see that sweet pea grow up, I tried to act happy and smiled when my wife told me that our baby was the size of a sweet pea. I went to work that morning, and near the end of my shift, I found myself standing in the frozen food aisle fighting back tears. I closed my eyes and asked myself, what's the point of living if it's time to carry out my plan? Just then, I heard my wife's name called twice from across the store. I turned to see a woman who. It seemed like a coincidence that I happened to share her name, but then I looked down and saw that I was holding a box of sweet peas. I started crying, but instead of carrying out my plan, I went home and told my wife everything. With her support, I received the help I needed, and now our sweet pea is 2 years old and has a sibling on the way. I live for them now, and they saved me. If you're having trouble, keep in mind that no matter how difficult things get, there are people who care and want to help. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Story 18. I was sent to a military school in the Midwest for 2 months the summer after my freshman year of high school. It wasn't because of behavioral problems. Rather, it was because I received a D in algebra. My parents are truly wonderful people, and although I was upset about it at the time, I can now see how it seemed like a good idea in theory. My mom is Catholic, and my dad is Jewish, but at the time, I felt more connected to my Jewish heritage. One day, I revealed that I was Jewish, and that's when my time at military school became I was subjected to verbal and physical abuse every day while I was there, and towards the end, the main instigator decided to have me crucify myself in our cabin. He tied me to 2 brooms lined up in a cross, and the group then beat and harassed me with whatever they could find. I've never told anyone the full extent of what happened. I told my parents and my best friend about the beatings, but not about the mock crucifixion because it felt too much to bear, and I doubted anyone. I think that experience was a turning point for me, possibly igniting my shift toward atheism. I almost feel a strange sense of resilience because of it. I faced what felt like pure blind hatred, and yet I'm still standing right after it happened. When the memory resurfaced, I went through periods of severe depression, and I struggled to understand how it happened. It's been about 7 years since it happened, and I actually blocked out the memory until I went to a psychologist for additional testing 2 years ago. Story 19. In the mid to late 1990s, I had a roommate from Amsterdam. We both enjoyed smoking high-quality cannabis, so one year we decided to travel to Amsterdam for the Cannabis Cup. While there, I met many of his family members and friends, some of whom were involved in illegal activities. I've come to terms with the fact that some people harbor such deep hatred toward others. It still baffles me, but I've come to terms with the fact that there are people who are consumed by hate every day. Several of his close friends engaged in drug dealing, including ecstasy, which is not unusual in the Netherlands. One night, we felt like trying some, so one of his friends brought over 2 big bags of pills and told us to take as many as we wanted. We took a lot that night, and we still had plenty left to take home. A few months later, my roommate decided to go back to Amsterdam, so I went with him. We met the same guy again, and I told him. He said, "We can get more over there if you have people who want them." Being a businessman, I made a deal with him and we got some pills to bring back. We returned without any issues, and the pills sold out quickly. His friend was impressed by the quick turnaround and wanted to send more, so we came up with ideas for safe and affordable ways to bring them in. At first, we had some success mailing them concealed in big candy boxes, but as the number of shipments and pills increased, when packages began to be intercepted, we tried a few different approaches before deciding that the most efficient and economical way was to have couriers fly them into the country. These professionals would swallow pills wrapped in protective covers for the flight and then retrieve them when they arrived. Another strategy was to conceal the pills in specially made vests worn under coats. Each courier could carry roughly 8,000 pills, but this method was riskier because of sporadic security checks, but business was booming. I kept a low profile, but my roommate's need to flaunt himself started to cause friction between us. He was partying nearly every night, which affected his judgment. He craved attention and started hanging out with a different crowd. One of these new acquaintances, who had just been released from jail, received a call for a large order, so he set up a meeting, but it turned out to be more difficult than bringing the pills in. Via setup, he was arrested with our entire supply, and it would be weeks before we could replenish in his impaired state. My roommate made the reckless decision to go back to Amsterdam to bring back more pills. He taped a bag of pills to his inner thigh and took some for the flight, and as was to be expected, he was caught. His friends in Amsterdam were not happy, and they contacted me, worried that his reckless behavior was endangering everything, and asked me to take over. We decided that I would run the company while he awaited his court hearing, but he wouldn't know that I was carrying on with reliable friends in other cities. As the business grew, I eventually got in touch with a friend, Mike, who lived overseas. He had a connection to someone whose father was a major trafficker, and Mike assured me that they would be interested as long as the quality was good. We set up a meeting, and a courier brought a vest full of pills. As Mike and I sat at the trafficker compound, it struck me how large this place had grown. Complete with a private zoo and numerous armed guards. They were pleased with the product, and Mike's contact, whom I'll call Steve, was scheduled to speak with his father about the deal the following day. However, Steve vanished, and we moved to a nearby city. When I got to Mike's hotel, I discovered him in a terrible state, overdosing and acting strangely. I was unable to let the Amsterdam partners see him in that state, so I checked him into another hotel and kept the pills. Discovered our international transactions and felt deceived, which made an already stressful situation even worse. The next day Mike felt better, so we went aboard a bus with the pills, but as we did, we saw military police conducting searches. Mike's girlfriend said that this was strange, and since there was no way to turn around without drawing attention, I made myself throw up to get us out of line. We then hurried in a taxi and took a costly 2-hour ride to another city. After being shaken by the near miss, a trafficker's relative told us that Steve's father didn't approve of the deal and wanted to see us. We realized that Steve's father was a powerful figure, and we suspected that he was behind the police presence at the bus station. Now that we were afraid for our lives and stuck with thousands of unsold pills, we tried to find new buyers, but potential customers seemed unreliable or connected to Steve's father, so we chose to stay low and switch to less expensive hotels every day. As our paranoia increased, I contracted food poisoning, which I thought was poisoning by our enemies. I collected my belongings, told the others I needed medical attention, and took a plane home. After seeing a doctor, I severed all contact with my ex-partners, completed college, and established a respectable career. I'm thankful for the lessons that chaotic time taught me because they're still useful in the business world. In retrospect, I'm glad that things ended when they did because I could have ended up in jail or worse, but my record stayed spotless. Wasn't as fortunate. According to a news article I later read, he served 3 years in federal prison. I've never told this story before, and even if I did, I doubt anyone would believe it. Story 20. I always liked this guy who played against my brother's baseball team in middle school. I thought he was the cutest boy ever, and we even discovered that we had the same birthday. He seemed so cool, but we didn't end up attending the same school until high school, so he was absent from my story for a while. No matter where I was secretly struggling with severe depression during middle school and into my senior year. If you had asked anyone in my high school how I felt, they would never have guessed that I was considering self-destructive coping mechanisms. I didn't want anyone to label me, I just wanted to be liked. I even tried suicide during my sophomore year, but I kept it a secret. The only people who knew were my online friends from sites like my yearbook. I even had a few online relationships, one of which lasted for a couple of years. As high school progressed, I gained popularity because I was a naturally gregarious person who everyone liked or at least got along with. I didn't have many people who didn't like me, but my depression perplexed me. I had a lot going for me, including a wonderful family, positive relationships, and social acceptance, but I was also full of self-loathing. By my senior year, I was Miss High School, the ASB president, involved in practically everything, and I even won prom queen with a quarterback and homecoming queen with the guy. He was drunk, and I was the designated driver, so I didn't think much of it. I still had that middle school crush on him, but I didn't take it seriously because he was intoxicated. Later that year, we hung out and kissed again, had a nice conversation, and then abruptly he stopped talking to me. It was painful, but I couldn't let go of the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, my life seemed to be turning around and I was finally coming out of the shadows of depression. The night before I left for college, we got together again, confessed our feelings for one another, and ended up being intimate. After that, we just lay there staring into each other's eyes, trying to remember everything he told me, like how beautiful I was, how he wished I didn't have to leave, and how he wanted to be with me. Needless to say, I fell in love with him again, but he abruptly stopped connecting with me again. I thought that we were far away and that I would never have to deal with him again, but life has a funny way of surprising you. During my freshman year's spring break, I saw him at a party. It was awkward at first, but we hugged and got along well. It seemed like he would leave whenever I went into a room, and vice versa, but after he got some liquid courage, he came over to apologize, and I told him I forgave him. The party went on until everyone became a little inebriated and began sharing stories, including one of his. After he finished, Will continued to look straight at me. He leaned in and kissed me in front of everyone, which shocked me, but it felt right, like it was meant to be our moment. By the end of the night, we had kissed again, and he tried to start an intimate relationship, but I refused because I didn't want to get H again. He suggested that we just lay down together, which sounded comforting in my drunken state. As we lay there, things got more intense, but at one point, I started to sober up and became anxious. I asked him to stop apologizing, saying I couldn't continue, because I had. After a while, I felt helpless and defeated, so I just let it happen. He passed out shortly after, by which time everyone else had left the party, leaving the house cold, dark, and empty. I found a spot on the couch and sobbed. I tried calling my best friend for a ride, but she had class the next month. I had convinced myself that physical proximity could somehow make him love me, but he didn't stop when I asked. The time was 4 a.m. I was able to call another friend, but she, like everyone else, assumed that I had voluntarily been with Will. I only told my best friend about what had actually happened, and then she told Will's brother, who told Will that he was devastated when he called my best friend in tears, saying he loved and cared about me and that he never meant to hurt me. I ignored his calls, but he turned to texting, so I finally replied telling him, "If anyone reads this, please leave a comment or reply. I don't intend to seek validation, but it feels freeing to let it all out. I'm curious to know how many people now know my secret story." 31. I'm only 19, but I've already struggled with heavy drinking and much of my life has been affected by alcohol. I found that I forgave him but asked him never to treat another girl like that. Oddly, I never fully acknowledged that what happened was ass salt because I was so consumed by my feelings for him. I've been built on lies. I've lied about a variety of topics such as personal struggles and past experiences. I tend to be passive and allow things to happen that I later regret, which occasionally causes me to drink to numb the feelings. I tend to make decisions based on what seems beneficial in the moment, even if it means hurting someone close to me. I frequently look to others for sympathy, sometimes for things I've exaggerated or even caused myself, and every day I wake up trying to figure out how to get by with little effort. I create a. The majority of my friends and roommates underestimate me because of this act, which I use to my advantage. I frequently find myself lying, cheating, or manipulating situations to get through the day. I haven't been able to break this cycle, and occasionally I turn to drinking as a way to escape the consequences of my actions. Story 22. My military career has been the most difficult part of my life and my biggest regret. It's a chapter that I spent 4 years on active duty in the Army, specializing in a combat field, after high school, driven by a family legacy and a desire to follow in my father's footsteps. At the time, I thought it was a noble path, but I didn't fully understand the reality of it. During those 4 years, I was deployed twice, once to Afghanistan and once to Iraq at the age of 19, which made me feel unworthy of my family and daughter and prevented me from developing a relationship with her. A young child approached our vehicles one day while our unit had stopped to survey and secure an area. It wasn't unusual for children to approach us and ask for candy or rations, but this time it was different. The child, who was about 6 or 8 years old, was by himself when a senior officer yelled at me to shoot because I was in the way of his line of fire. At the time, I was still a teenager and couldn't understand. My superiors later told me that I did what was required but that I acted a moment too late. To this day, I still see the child's face in my nightmares. I frequently wake up feeling the heat of the sun, and I have vivid memories of that place, but most of all, I am still confused about why I needed to harm a child. The child managed to throw a grenade into one of our vehicles while I was hesitating, seriously injuring 3 of my comrades. Haunted by the memory of that child, I haven't told my wife about my army service because I'm afraid of how she would view me if she knew. This is especially true since I already found it difficult to see myself as anything other than a flawed person. When my wife told me she was pregnant, it was the happiest moment of my life, but when I held my daughter for the first time 9 months later, I wasn't overcome with happiness but rather with grief, guilt, and a profound sense of unworthiness. When I was younger, my mother and I were fleeing from my unstable father, who had completely lost touch with reality and was convinced that he needed to take us both to heaven with him. This realization breaks my heart and makes me question whether I would be more valuable to my daughter as a life insurance policy than as a father. I am painfully aware that I have taken away from another what I am experiencing right now. I cannot justify to myself why I deserve to feel the joy of being a father after taking someone else's child from them. We stopped at a dilapidated hotel in the middle of nowhere one night, and as we got comfortable, I heard a car pull up outside. Since we had been on the run for months, I was always on edge, so I got up to look out the window and saw an elderly man getting out of a truck, feeling somewhat reassured. I turned away from the window, but then I heard another car door close, and when I looked out again, I saw nothing. Despite my uneasiness, I decided it wasn't worth waking my mom, who hadn't been sleeping well for a while, and I lay down again and tried to sleep for about 20 minutes when I heard a noise that made me turn over to see how my mom was doing. I saw that the door to our hotel room was being forced open by the chain lock, and my father was at the door trying to cut the chain. I jumped out of bed and ran to wake her up, but she was so sleepy that she stumbled and fell. Running on adrenaline, I pulled her to the bathroom window and smashed it open, shattering the glass and helping my mom climb through, and as she landed on the other side, I heard the door explode open behind me. I hurried after her, landing on her leg as I scrambled through the window. She cried out in pain, and when I tried to help her up, she was unable to put weight on the leg I had just landed on. Panicked, I thought that hiding her in a nearby shed used for pool equipment might help, so I decided to go back and try to get the car leaving my mom. As I got to the hotel's corner, my father grabbed me by the arm and almost pulled me off my feet. He then produced a knife, but I was able to free myself before he could use it. I fled toward the road, thinking he was going to catch me, but I saw a car approaching and barely crossed it before passing out from exhaustion. The driver of the car stopped and came over to ask, "Hey kid, are you okay?" and extended his hand to help, but before I could react, my father appeared behind him. When I returned to the hotel, my mother was still safely inside the shed. The truck, the stranger, and his car were all gone. I never told my mother what had happened that night, and as far as I know, that man became just another missing person story 23. I was frozen in shock as the man fell to the ground, and my father turned his emotionless gaze toward me and started walking in my direction. I was terrified, but somehow my legs managed to move, and I'm still not sure how I managed to escape. When my ex-girlfriend's mother died, she asked me to move in with her, and I ended up living in her mother's room. At the time, I had saved about $220,000 by working hard at a good company, and I was only 22 years old. A year later, I was left with barely $1,000, while my ex was seeing several men from the apartment complex and wasn't working. I doubt I'll ever see any of the $6,000 she owes me because I've frequently given money to friends and friends. Getting paid back or getting any kind of appreciation, I used to travel great distances to see people always spending money as if it were nothing in the hopes that they would like me or help me when I needed it. Even now, it's difficult to get anyone to stop by unless we're going out to eat or I'm giving away free drinks. I've reached a point where I don't care about anyone anymore. Today, a friend from 7th grade stopped by, but he hardly ever returns my calls or texts, so I was afraid I would finally tell him. When I was in college, I had a difficult part-time job delivering newspapers in a rough neighborhood. Since most of those old housing projects lacked elevators, I had to run up the stairs of each apartment building because I had to deliver the newspapers to everyone by 6 a.m. One subscriber lived on the top floor of a building with an extremely slow elevator, which ironically became my favorite stop because it was the only time I could take a break during the ride up and down. Otherwise, I would be fined if people complained about late deliveries, and believe me, people love to complain. I would typically arrive at that building a little after 5 a.m. At the end of 4 months of this boring job, I decided to change things up. I started my route from the last building on the list and worked my way backward. It wasn't much, but it was something different to break up the monotonous grind. When I finally arrived at my favorite building, it was earlier than usual, and for the first time, the old lady wasn't there feeding the cats. Instead, a group of cats sat by the building's glass door waiting for her. Although it might not seem like much, after 4 months of the same routine, it felt like a breath of fresh air. I was no longer just feeling good on autopilot. I walked in and called for the elevator to be ready for my usual rest, but something was wrong. The elevator button was already lit up, so I paused and realized that someone was probably coming down. As I waited, a strange sense of excitement kicked in, and I made the ridiculous plan to hide next to the elevator and try to startle whoever was inside. It seemed like a fun idea, but when the disclaimer came, I realized that this was not the best idea, especially in a bad part of town. I squatted next to the elevator, and as it slowly descended, my heart was racing. I thought, what if I scare the wrong person? And told myself that in the worst case, I could give them a free newspaper and apologize. Eventually, the elevator arrived with a loud mechanical thud, and the doors opened. As soon as the first glimmer of light appeared, I jumped up and let out a loud boo. What followed was a blur. I felt milk splash all over me, and when I turned around, I saw the elderly woman lying still on the elevator floor. Panic struck, and I looked around for assistance, but all I saw were the cats outside, staring at me through the glass door. I realized that this was the same woman who fed the cats every morning, and when I looked at my watch, it was 4:57 a.m. Before I left, I realized I hadn't delivered the newspaper yet, so I did the only thing I could think of. I carefully tucked the old lady's legs back into the elevator and got in with her, riding up to the 7th floor. The smell of cat food, spilled milk, and general mustiness filled the small room. Right around the time I usually arrived, I was paralyzed with fear, tears in my eyes, and I slowly walked back toward the exit, trying to convince myself that this was just a nightmare. I almost passed out during the longest elevator journey of my life, and it seemed like the ultimate walk of shame to leave that building with 17 cats staring at me. I never saw any police officers or heard anyone inquire about the woman after that, so I suppose everyone assumed she had had a heart attack.